Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the twilight zone of this age and technology. Am I saying that this age and technology that we live is a twilight zone? No. But in philosophy, it's always important to do thought experiments where we may not believe in the example that we're using, but we use the example as a starting point for evolution of our thinking as we go through the topic and the details and everything that is involved in it. For example, up until the 1800s, we lived pretty much the same way as centuries before. We were riding on horses, there was no electricity. There was, however, already a movement in Europe, starting in the Renaissance. And it was actually before the Renaissance was when we had the Age of Discovery, when the Portuguese and Spanish discovered the Americas and were navigating the oceans. And the Renaissance and Enlightenment and scientific revolution. So there was already a movement prior to the age we live in. And of course, this movement that was present prior to the 20th century is what led to the world we live in. So everything begins in steps, right? Nothing appears out of nowhere. Nothing pops into existence from non-existence. We got to start from a point source. We got to start from somewhere. So this began in Europe, in Western Europe, I should say, um, because in ancient world, the great thinkers of the ancient world in the European civilization were the Greeks. But right around the year 200 BC, I don't know why, but the Greek civilization stopped generating uh, updates to our knowledge in philosophy or science. So 200 years BC, there was a halt and a stagnation. And the Greek civilization was the beginning of Western thought and Western identity. And they were put to sleep. I don't know what happened, to be honest. It was actually after Alexander the Great conquered Persia, because at the time Alexander the Great conquered Persia, at that time Alexander was tutored by Aristotle, so he was in an age where Greeks were still producing knowledge or teaching. After the Alexander the Great's invasion of Persia, that was it. No more. It was the end. And the Romans were not interested in science either, in knowledge. So they didn't add anything to it. After the fall of the Roman Empire, we entered the Dark Age, an age where we made no progress. Well, some people may argue, oh, there was progress. Yeah, yeah, sure. There was a lot of copying things written in the past, preserving literature, until in the Renaissance, which began in Italy. Why is it called Renaissance? It's called rebirth. It's the idea of trying to make progress, trying to update how much we know. Because I have to confess that there was a huge stagnation. We stopped, literally. So that means that, and then after the Renaissance, it triggered a domino effect, which led to the Enlightenment, scientific revolution. Figures such Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, uh, Copernicus, in astronomy, physics. Ironically, Science began with astronomy and physics. So it appears to me that the sky is the most interesting thing that there is, because uh, the beginnings of science, Galileo, for example, was an astronomer and a physicist. Science began with physics and philosophy, and then mathematics. We obtained the Arabic Hindu numerical system 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 from the East. We adopt this in our mathematics that facilitated algebra, led to calculus, differential equations, and to technology. However, even though that these centuries prior to the 20th century were centuries where there wasn't the technology that we have today, these were centuries that were leading to it. There was a spark of inspiration in the European mind. Looked like they were seeing the future somehow. There was a great movement, social movements in France, Germany, England. There was a lot of movement going on. I'm not going to get into details here exactly, uh, but we had the French Revolution, the American Constitution, everything preparing for something in the future. And what was this future? This future that they were preparing for is the modern age. The 1900s was a huge Twilight Zone sort of feeling. The changes that happened in every decade were unequal in the past, because in the past, the changes took centuries, but sometimes for centuries, nothing would change. For centuries, nothing would change. And honestly, civilization began in the year 4000 BC. I did not see much of a difference between 4000 BC and 70 AC. So, for example, stagnation is fairly common in human civilization, unless some other nation or some other culture comes in with some strange ideas and creates a revolution that dominates the world and leads to a new world order, which is exactly what happened. Because in the ancient world, the world was Asian or Middle Eastern. Right around, uh, right around 500 BC, that's when Greece came in and started the what we call the beginnings of Western civilization. But then they went stagnant as well. They went to sleep, and so did Rome. So going to sleep is something that happens, and something that happened a lot in the past. So that's why there was the Renaissance, rebirth, reawake. Like, look, let's awake for to design the future that will be coming soon. The 20th century was very unusual. There was a feeling of the Twilight Zone. Technology took over everything, literally everything. Electricity, radio, television, telephones, airplanes, submarines, so helicopters, strange machines began doing things that we couldn't even imagine in the past. Doesn't that bring a Twilight Zone feeling for it? What is this? 2 years is enough for everything to change. A new cell phone. So what I'm trying to say is that compared to the ages in the past, since the beginning of human civilization, the one we are in right now is the most unusual of them all. Like some people say, well, it's because there's some aliens and humans among us doing all these changes without us being aware of it. Let's think with our feet on the ground. Let's not get into myth and folklore. We also learn from this modern civilization that we should think in a way that is solid, concrete. We can't just fancy things out. But the idea that there's something unusual going on is true. But there's also a problem. You know how in the history of humanity, civilizations make a tremendous amount of progress, and then all of a sudden they go to sleep, and then there's nothing for a long time until somebody or some other nation takes over and enacts a new system of civilization, a new world order. What's the problem with this happening again? But the problem is this: if we live in this age, which I say the twilight zone of technology, everything is very different from the past. But what worries me more is if we go to sleep again. Because if we do that, what could that mean? What if you get in a time machine, let's say to the 200 years in the future, about 200 years in the future, and you go and I say, okay, look, what did you see 200 years in the future? Did we go to the moon again? Well, let's pretend. I don't know if we will, but imagine if we never go to the moon again for a long, long time, or Mars, and the citizens, the people that remain here, the other generations, we will know even less about the age we lived in. And they will make even less progress, if any. And this could mean that this is an indication of us once again going back to sleep. It's always the problem with generations because we cannot live forever. But when one generation goes away and another generation takes over, there's always a loss of tradition. Take my example as a thought experiment. I never met my great grandparents. I grew up listening to stories from my grandparents about their family history. Funny enough, I cannot remember the details of any of them, so I have no clue where I came from. So when the generation goes away, it's not always easy to transmit the information to the next generation. And what happened is there's a weakening of, or it loses impetus. It loses the tradition. So the fact is, if we go to 2060 and 2070 in a time machine and we see that the people there act like they have no clue what the 1970s or 60s were like, and they act completely different, and there's different values for everything. There's difference in everything. But the issue is leading civilization back to sleep. And there are other dangers too, because how are we going to deal with climate change if technology comes to a halt? Will future generations be able to generate technology to overcome climate change and other issues? Because in the past, when the Romans and the Greeks fell into deep, deep sleep, there was no need for progress either, because the world was not going to end. But today, if we fall to sleep today, how are we going to think and generate new forms of technology to be able to survive the harsh centuries in the future with desertification, new pandemics, the issue of overpopulation, the issue of poverty? If everybody's going to sleep starting in 2024, 2030, 2040, 2050, who's going to be the philosopher to fix all of these problems? Literally, we cannot go to sleep right now, because if we do, it's going to be disastrous. Because we need to put our philosophical mind to work to fix the situation, to bring solutions, instead of us delve into another dark age in the wrong time. When after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a dark age, but that dark age was not a threat to human existence. But a dark age today will be, because now more than ever, we need these thinkers, these great minds, and it's hard to find in the modern world. No offense, but we are the great minds in the modern world. Who are we relying on? See what I'm saying? Usually this is really an indication that things are getting slow. I know technology is still progressing at an extremely fast pace. Because remember, we're in the twilight zone of technology. But we're losing something really important. And that's quite worrisome. So I have no clue what the future awaits us. And to be honest, anything can happen in the near future. Anything. Now, if you want to, for the future to be, look, you want to do, like you want, like, if you imagine us like living like Star Trek or Star Wars, or um, going into space, traveling through wormholes, contacting aliens if they are there, if they exist, revolutionizing information even more, creating satellite cities around planets. I understand we cannot land on Venus, but we can definitely build an international space station orbiting Venus. Developing cures for several diseases, solving major social problems, bringing the world together. We need thinkers, and that's what we're lacking. So this is one thing I would like to close the video because it's getting too long, but it's important to not go to sleep right now. And what is going on is the exact opposite. There's a lack of leadership. There's a lack of reference going on. My only advice is look into the past. Read about Rome. Read about Greece. Even read about Babylon and Assyria and Egypt, the Near East, the near civilizations to Europe. Try to understand our failures and why some civilizations were more successful. Try to create a map for how you think things should be in the future, preserving the tradition that always brought prosperity to civilization. So there's a tremendous need to do that because if we don't do that, if we don't plan ahead, if we don't do any of that, it's going to be disastrous. In the next few videos, I'm going to explain how to teach physics, incorporating thought process, like theory of knowledge. And I'll leave that for the next videos. Thanks for watching.